In 1965, a quiet man in a gray jacket stood in line at the Forbidden City and paid for a ticket. Inside, he pointed at the throne and told strangers he used to sit there. Nobody believed him. He was the last emperor of China. He worked as a gardener, and he was not the only one. 20 minutes from Washington, D.C., in a low-income housing complex in Virginia, a 7'2" African king was living on food stamps and handing out chocolate to the neighbors' children. In Seoul, a prince born inside a palace was sleeping in the back of a van and washing in public bathhouses, and a boy king who lost his throne before he was old enough to shave came back half a century later and was elected prime minister of the country that threw him out. These are the people who were born to rule and ended up living like the rest of us. Some of them fell apart. Some of them, and this is the part nobody expects, ended up happier than they had ever been. Start with the gardener. If you had walked through the Beijing Botanical Gardens in the early 1960s, you might have seen him. A middle-aged man in cheap clothes and thick round glasses, kneeling in the dirt, thinning seedlings and watering flower beds. Co-workers said he was pleasant enough, not much of a talker, terrible at anything practical at first. He had to be shown how to hold the tools. There was a reason for that. For the first half of his life, this man had never tied his own shoelaces. He had never poured his own tea, never dressed himself, never opened a door with his own hands. He had a staff of over 1,000 people to do those things. He was Aisin Jioro Puyi, and at the age of 2 years and 10 months, he had been made Emperor of China. The story of how he got to that flower bed is one of the strangest lives of the 20th century. He was taken from his mother in the middle of the night in November 1908, screaming, carried into the Forbidden City by palace officials. The old Empress Dowager was dying. She wanted a child on the throne she could name from her deathbed. So a toddler was put in front of thousands of prostrating officials and told he was now the son of heaven, the ruler of a quarter of the people alive on earth. He cried through the whole ceremony. His father knelt beside him and told him it would be over soon. It was over in about 3 years. The revolution of 1911 swept the empire away, and in February 1912, the child emperor abdicated. But here is the strange part, the part that shaped everything that came after. Nobody made him leave. Under the deal signed with the new republic, Puyi was allowed to keep his title, his eunuchs, his servants, and the northern half of the Forbidden City. So he grew up inside a museum of a dead empire, being addressed as Your Majesty by hundreds of people while, outside the walls, China went on without him. He was 15 before anyone told him the country he supposedly ruled had a president. He learned English from a Scottish tutor, gave himself the name Henry, ordered Western suits and a bicycle, and rode it around courtyards that had not seen a bicycle in 500 years. He had the door sills of the palace sawed off so his bike could roll through. 5 centuries of imperial architecture cut down so a bored teenager could ride around. In 1924, a warlord got tired of the arrangement and gave him 3 hours to get out. Puyi walked out of the only home he had ever known and into a country that had no use for him at all. What he did next is why the rest of his life is so hard to talk about simply. Puyi wanted his throne back. Badly. And in 1932, the Japanese, who had just invaded Manchuria, offered him one. They built him a puppet state called Manchukuo, gave him a palace, put a crown on his head, and used his name to stamp their occupation with something that looked like legitimacy. He signed what they put in front of him. He knew what was happening in his name, and he signed anyway. It is the thing that turned him from a sad footnote into something closer to a collaborator, and he spent the rest of his life being asked about it. When the war ended, Soviet troops arrested him at an airfield trying to flee to Japan. He spent 5 years in Siberia, testified at the Tokyo war crimes trials, and in 1950 was handed over to the Chinese communists, who put him in a prison in Fushun for war criminals and told him he was going to be re-educated. Here is where the story turns into something else. They did not execute him. They put him in a cell with ordinary prisoners and started at the beginning. He was taught to wash his own clothes. He was taught to sew a button. He was made to fold his own bedding, which he was so bad at that other inmates did it for him out of pity. A man who had been worshipped as a living god at the age of 2 was taught, in his 40s, how to be a functioning adult human being. He wrote confession after confession. He was made to watch films of what had been done in Manchuria under his signature. In 1959, after nearly a decade, he was pardoned, and the last emperor of China walked out of prison and into the life of an ordinary Beijing citizen with a residence permit and a job. He worked as a gardener. Later, he was moved to a research post in the historical archives, editing documents about the dynasty he used to be. He rode public buses. He got lost in the city his family had ruled for 300 years, and there are accounts of him stopping strangers to ask directions, mentioning almost as small talk that he used to be the emperor. People laughed at him. One woman reportedly told him to stop making things up, and on his days off, he did the thing that no one who hears it ever forgets. He would walk to the Forbidden City, join the line with the other tourists, buy a ticket to get into his own house, and walk through the halls of his childhood. He would stop and point. That was my throne. I used to play in that courtyard. That room was where they dressed me. Strangers assumed he was a harmless old man with a story. There is one more thing about those Forbidden City visits that says everything. The staff eventually figured out who he was. Some of them were kind about it. And on at least one occasion, according to accounts from the period, he was able to help the museum because he could look at an object in a display case or a room laid out by curators doing their best with old records and tell them they had it wrong. The furniture went the other way. That was not kept there. He was the last living source on a world that had already become a museum exhibit, and he had to buy a ticket to consult on it. He married a hospital nurse in 1962. Friends said those were the happiest years he ever had, which is a remarkable thing to say about a man who had once owned a quarter of humanity. He published a memoir. He voted in an election and told a reporter it was the first time in his life he had felt like a real citizen rather than a symbol. His last years were not gentle. The Cultural Revolution broke out in 1966, and mobs began hunting down anyone connected to the Old World. There was no better symbol of the Old World alive in China than Puyi. He was harassed. The state quietly moved to protect him, but he was frightened, and he was already sick. He died of kidney cancer in October 1967, 61 years old, with no title, no honors, and no throne. His ashes were eventually moved to a commercial cemetery near the tombs of the emperors he descended from. You can pay to visit him too, from living god to gardener, inside a single lifetime. If that feels like a story only communist China could produce, here is one that happened on a quiet block in New York City, 4 flights up, above a restaurant. For 64 years, the neighbors on Lexington Avenue in the East 70s knew the old man in apartment 3 as the fellow with all the dogs. At one point, there were 12 of them in a 2-bedroom walk-up, and he paid the neighborhood kids pocket money to take them around the block. He was polite, dry, well-dressed in a slightly old-fashioned way, and he had an accent that people could never quite place. The apartment was rent-controlled. You got to it up a narrow, dim staircase. His name was Ertugrul Osman, and if history had gone differently, he would have been the ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents for 600 years. He was born in Istanbul in 1912, a grandson of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Ottoman Empire in those years was the sick man of Europe, but it was still an empire, and he was still a prince of it. He was born in a palace on the Bosphorus. As a small boy, he played in Dolmabahce Palace, which has 285 rooms and a chandelier weighing 4.5 tons, a gift from Queen Victoria. At 10, he was sent to Vienna for school. It was a normal thing for a boy in his position. He packed for a term abroad and left, and that turned out to be the last ordinary day of his childhood. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. In March 1924, the new Turkish Republic under Ataturk went further and expelled the entire imperial family from the country. Every one of them. Ertugrul Osman described the order for the rest of his life in a single flat sentence. The men were given 1 day to leave, and the women were given a week. He was 12 years old, sitting in a classroom in Austria, when he found out he had no home to go back to. He would not set foot in Turkey again for 53 years. What happened to the rest of that family is worth knowing, because it is the same story repeated 156 times. That is the actual number stripped of Turkish citizenship and deported in March 1924. They left from Sirkeci station in Istanbul, most of them having never lived anywhere else, and they were given a year to sell off whatever they owned before the treasury took it. The travel documents Turkey issued them expired after 12 months, so by 1925, a large part of the imperial house of a 600-year empire was scattered across Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, Nice, and Paris, with no country and no valid papers. Historians of the period record princes and pashas doing manual labor to eat, and some sliding into outright destitution. The last caliph of Islam himself ended up on the French Riviera. The women of the family were finally allowed home in 1952. The men had to wait until 1974, half a century after the trains left, and by then, most of them were in graves in other countries. Ertugrul Osman drifted, the way exiles do. Vienna, then Paris, where he studied at the school that trains French diplomats. In 1933, he came to the United States. By 1939, he was in New York. In 1945, he moved into that apartment on Lexington Avenue, and he simply never left. He worked. He was a consultant for a mining company that sent him back and forth to South America, and he spent decades doing the kind of unglamorous business travel that millions of Americans did in those years. He rode the subway. He shopped for his own groceries. In 1947, he married a woman from Johannesburg, and when she died in 1985, he was a widower in a walk-up at the age of 73. Then something wonderful happened. At a party in 1987, he met an Afghan princess almost 30 years younger than him, a niece of the exiled king of Afghanistan. They married in 1991. Two people from two collapsed monarchies, both of them living in New York, both of them going about their business on the Upper East Side. Here is the detail that says everything about him. For most of his life, he refused to carry the passport of any country because he considered himself a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had ceased to exist. So his lawyer drew up a certificate, and he traveled the world on a document he had essentially issued to himself. It worked for decades. Then the September 11th attacks happened, security tightened everywhere, and a homemade passport stopped being charming. In 2004, at the age of 92, he finally accepted a Turkish passport. In 1992, the Turkish Prime Minister invited him home. He had been gone 53 years. He went to Dolmabahce Palace, the place he had run through as a child, and he walked it as a member of the public, on the tour with everybody else. The guides pointed out the rooms. He already knew which ones were which. Turkish reporters found him fascinating and kept asking whether he wanted the throne back. He told them he had no interest in titles, that he considered himself a practical man, and that democracy was working out fine in Turkey. When a filmmaker interviewed him and seemed disappointed that his life had not been more tragic, he told her, with a straight face, that a bad life would have made a better film. He died in Istanbul in September 2009 at 97, and Turkey buried him beside a sultan. The newspapers called him the last Ottoman. His widow stayed in the New York apartment, and when the building sold, she had to fight the new owner in court to keep her rent-controlled home. A princess of two empires, defending a lease. The next man on this list grew up in a cottage on the grounds of Windsor Castle. You have almost certainly heard of that cottage because 80 years later, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle lived in it. Frogmore Cottage was a grace and favor home, meaning the British monarch handed it to relatives who needed somewhere to live. In the 1920s, the relative who needed it was Grand Duchess Xenia, sister of Tsar Nicholas II, who had escaped Russia on a British warship with what she could carry. King George V, her first cousin, gave her the house. Her grandson was born in London in 1923 and grew up in that cottage. Queen Mary told him to call her Auntie Mary. His godfather was the man who would briefly become King Edward VIII. He was, in the most literal sense, royalty raised on royal ground. His name was Andrew Romanoff, and he would spend most of his life as a carpenter in Northern California. The Romanovs he descended from had ruled Russia for 304 years. Most of the ones who stayed were shot. His branch got out, and what got out was a family with a legendary name, an enormous number of cousins on other people's thrones, and almost no money. That is the part people miss about deposed royalty. The title survives the revolution. The bank account usually doesn't. When the Second World War came, he did not take a commission. He served as an ordinary sailor on a Royal Navy cruiser, and in December 1942, his ship escorted an Arctic convoy to Murmansk, hauling supplies to Stalin's Soviet Union. Read that again. A great-nephew of the last Tsar, on a freezing deck in the Barents Sea, delivering aid to the government that had killed his relatives, in a port on the Kola Bay that had once been named after his own family. After the war, he went to America, and in 1954, he became a United States citizen. And then he did what immigrants do. He worked. He was an agronomist. He was a broker. He sold real estate. He swung a hammer as a carpenter. He raised 3 sons. He lived in Inverness, a small town in West Marin County, north of San Francisco, in a place where nobody cared what your great-uncle used to be. His neighbors knew him as a gentle, funny man who painted odd, charming folk pictures without ever having taken an art class, and who knew exactly where the good mushrooms grew. He wore blue jeans and Birkenstocks. His wife, an artist herself, said he had no prejudice in him at all, that he treated everyone exactly the same. In 1998, he flew to St. Petersburg for the burial of Nicholas II and his family, whose remains had finally been identified after 80 years in a pit outside Yekaterinburg. In 2016, after the death of a cousin, this retired California carpenter became the head of the House of Romanov. He held that position, in blue jeans, in a small town in Marin County, until he died in 2021, at the age of 98. His great-aunt's story is even harder to believe, and it ends above a beauty salon in Toronto. In 1951, a department store in Toronto held a small art exhibition. Among the paintings for sale were watercolors of Canadian landscapes, farm scenes, flowers in kitchen windows, signed simply with the name Olga. They were good. They were also cheap because the woman who painted them needed the money to keep a 200-acre farm running. She was born Olga Alexandrovna Romanova in Peterhof Palace outside St. Petersburg in 1882. Her father was Alexander III, Emperor of all Russia. Her brother was Nicholas II, the last Tsar. She was the youngest daughter, the one everybody in that family agreed was the least impressed by any of it. She was a strange fit for a palace from the beginning. As a girl, she liked drawing better than dancing, and she liked being outdoors better than either. When the First World War came, she did not do what most Grand Duchesses did, which was to lend her name to a hospital and visit occasionally with flowers. She trained as a nurse and worked in field hospitals near the front, changing dressings, holding down soldiers during procedures, in filth and blood for years. Soldiers who had no idea who she was called her sister. In 1916, she married a cavalry officer named Nikolai Kulikovsky. He was not royal. Her family thought it was a scandal. In the eyes of the imperial court, she had married beneath herself, and that decision, more than any other, is probably why she was still alive in 1918, when her brother, his wife, and their 5 children were shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg. She got out through the Crimea, then Denmark, where her mother, the Dowager Empress, lived out her days in a state of permanent denial, insisting to the end that her sons were still alive somewhere in Russia. When the old woman died, Olga and her husband bought a dairy farm outside Copenhagen and got to work. She kept painting, Over her lifetime, she made more than 2,000 pictures, and she sold them. Not as a hobby with a nice story attached. She sold them because that was the household income. Then, in 1948, Stalin's government told the Danes she was a conspirator against the Soviet Union. She was 66 years old, and she was being hunted again. So the family sold what they had and got on a ship to Halifax, and in June of that year, a train pulled into Union Station in Toronto, carrying a grandmother, her sons, and her grandchildren. The next day, a newspaper ran a photograph of them and called them New Canadians. They bought a farm in Campbellville, Ontario. The daughter of the Emperor of all Russia fed the chickens, raised cattle and pigs, kept the flower beds, and painted watercolors that she sold to pay for feed. Neighbors who bought eggs from her mostly had no idea. She was a small, cheerful, weathered woman with a thick accent, and she once said she was proud of her wrinkles because they made her look like a Russian peasant, and that there was nothing wrong with looking like a Russian peasant. By 1952, her husband's health was going, and the farm was too much. They sold it and moved into a 5-room bungalow on Camilla Road in Cooksville, a suburb that is now part of Mississauga. 5 rooms, stuffed with flower pots, paintings, and faded photographs of a world that no longer existed. A large portrait of her father, the Emperor, hung in the living room of a little Ontario bungalow. Her husband died in that house in 1958. And then, in the summer of 1959, something happened that captures the whole strange shape of her life. Queen Elizabeth II was touring Canada aboard the royal yacht Britannia. An invitation was sent to lunch. It went to Mrs. Nikolai Kulikovsky of 2130 Camilla Road, Cooksville, Ontario, and Mrs. Kulikovsky accepted and went aboard and had lunch with the Queen of England, and then went home to her bungalow and her vegetable patch. The following year, her health failed. She moved in with friends, a former officer of the Imperial Guard and his wife, who lived at 716 Gerrard Street East in the East End of Toronto, in an apartment above the wife's business. The business was a beauty salon. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna died in that apartment in November 1960 at 78. 304 years of Romanov rule, ending over a hair salon on Gerrard Street. She was, in a way, lucky. Thousands of Russians who fled the revolution never got a farm or a bungalow or a portrait on the wall. They got Paris, and Paris was brutal. By the early 1920s, there were tens of thousands of Russian refugees in the city, and among them, an absurd concentration of princes, counts, generals, and grand dukes. There were so many that a saying went around the émigré community to sum up how they survived. The men drove taxis, and the women sewed. It was not a joke. Former officers became taxi drivers in enormous numbers, mostly because driving was one of the few useful skills the Imperial Army had actually taught them, and Parisians came to consider the Russian cabbies more reliable than the French ones. The ones who could not get a cab went to the Renault factory at Billancourt and stood on an assembly line for about $2 a day at a time when Henry Ford was paying $5. The women went into fashion, because needlework was the one skill an aristocratic girl was actually trained in. And one of them was Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, a first cousin of the Tsar, who arrived in Paris with nothing and started embroidering. Her brother introduced her to a designer he was seeing. The designer's name was Coco Chanel. For a while, the embroidery house run by the Emperor's own cousin sold to Chanel and nobody else. Dishwashers, window cleaners, bathroom attendants, waiters who had been decorated by the Tsar. That was the fine print of a fallen empire. Which brings us to a man who was decorated by Stalin, decorated by Harry Truman, and spent part of the 1950s raising chickens in England. The chicken farm was in Hertfordshire, north of London. The man running it had 5 daughters, a wife who had grown up in a French chateau, and very little money, and the birds were a serious business rather than a country hobby. He also grew and sold vegetables. Later, he flew as a test pilot for an aircraft equipment company, and at one point, he took a job with a brokerage house and spent his days on the business of the New York stock market. His name was Michael, and before any of that, he had been the king of Romania. Twice. He was 5 years old the first time. His father, Crown Prince Carol, was a spectacular embarrassment who ran off with his mistress and renounced his rights. So when the old king died in 1927, the crown went to a kindergartner. 3 years later, his father came back, decided he wanted the job after all, and took it. Michael was demoted from king to crown prince by his own dad, which is a sentence very few people in history have been able to say. He got it back in 1940, at 18, when his father was forced out. By then, Romania was inside Hitler's orbit, run in practice by a military dictator named Ion Antonescu, and Romanian troops were fighting on the Eastern Front. Michael was a teenage king with a title and no power. He was made to visit Berlin and sit through lunch with Hitler. He dined with Mussolini. His phones were tapped, his mail was read, and he listened to the BBC in secret. He also learned to fly, quietly. In the summer of 1944, with the Red Army coming and the German position collapsing, this 22-year-old did something almost nobody expected of him. He summoned Antonescu to the palace in Bucharest on the 23rd of August, told him to sign an armistice with the Allies, and when the dictator refused, Michael had him arrested on the spot. There was nowhere secure to put him, so they locked Hitler's Romanian strongman in a reinforced vault that the royal family had built to store a stamp collection. Romania switched sides that night. Historians have argued ever since about how many months it cut off the war in Europe, and the estimates run high. A king barely out of his teens changed the direction of the Eastern Front from inside his own palace, using a stamp room as a jail cell. For it, Harry Truman gave him the American Legion of Merit, the highest degree of it, and Stalin gave him the Order of Victory, the Soviet Union's most exclusive military decoration, awarded to only a handful of people on Earth and to almost no foreigners at all. Michael would live long enough to become the last surviving recipient of it in the world. 3 years later, the same Soviets took his country. In December 1947, he was called back from a trip abroad, brought to a palace room where the phone lines had been cut, and handed a pre-typed abdication. Sign it, he was told, or 1,000 arrested students and soldiers would be shot. He signed. The communists abolished the monarchy the same day and stripped him of his citizenship. He left on a train with what he could carry. And then he went to work. Chickens, vegetables, test flights, a brokerage. He and his wife raised 5 girls on a normal income in England and later in Switzerland, in a modest house near Lake Geneva. And for 4 decades, that was simply his life. Romanians who remembered him heard his voice once a year, on Christmas, on a Voice of America broadcast, and then went back to living under Ceausescu. When the regime finally fell, he tried to go home. On Christmas Day of 1990, 1 year after the revolution, he flew into Romania. The new government, which was full of recycled communists, panicked. He was intercepted, stopped by armored vehicles, driven to the airport, and put on a plane. The former king was deported from his own country by the people who had replaced the people who deported him. He came back for Easter in 1992, and roughly 1 million Romanians filled the streets of Bucharest to see him. It scared the government so badly that they blocked him again. He did not get his citizenship back until 1997, 50 years after they took it. He died in Switzerland in December 2017 at 96. Romania gave him a state funeral, and hundreds of thousands of people stood in the cold to watch the coffin of the chicken farmer who arrested a fascist dictator. The next one lived and died on American soil, and his neighbors gave him a nickname. At the Oak Creek Apartments in Oakton, Virginia, at the end of a dead-end road between Route 66 and Route 655, there was an old man everyone noticed, mostly because you could not miss him. He was 7 feet 2 inches tall. He walked in the evenings. He was unfailingly polite. He kept chocolate to hand out to the children in the complex. The families around him were working people who knew nothing about the small country he came from, so they gave him a title of their own. They called him the King of Africa. He was the King of Rwanda. Not a figurehead, not a pretender by courtesy. The last man to actually hold the throne. He was born Jean-Baptiste Ndahandurwa in 1936, and his childhood was already an exile story. His father, King Musinga, had been deposed by the Belgian colonial administration for being too independent, and the whole family was pushed out to a village in the Congo, where the old king died of pneumonia in 1944. His son grew up poor. He said later that everything in those years was difficult. In July 1959, his half-brother, King Mutara, died suddenly, and under circumstances nobody has ever fully explained. At his funeral, in front of the crowd, the 23-year-old was proclaimed the new Mwami. He took the name Kigeli V. Within months, Rwanda erupted. Within about 9 months, he was out of the country. In 1961, a referendum abolished the monarchy, and a man in his 20s became an ex-king with the rest of his life in front of him. He spent 3 decades moving around East Africa, and in 1992, he came to the United States and settled in the suburbs of Washington. He had no money. There is a reason for that which is almost poetic. Rwandan royal wealth was not held in gold or foreign bank accounts. It was held in cattle and land. A scholar who studied the monarchy put it plainly. He could not ship hundreds of cows to Washington. So the last king of Rwanda lived on food stamps, a Section 8 housing subsidy, Medicaid, donations of clothing and cash from supporters, and the occasional sale of a knighthood in an order of chivalry belonging to a kingdom that no longer existed. He never married. There was a custom that a king should not marry in exile, and he kept it for 55 years, which meant he had no children and no heir, and spent his evenings alone in a subsidized townhouse, watching wrestling on television and working the telephone, calling Rwandans all over the world for news. There was one asset he still controlled, and it was strange. A king, even a king with no kingdom, can create knights. So from a subsidized townhouse in Virginia, he handed out titles and decorations in the dynastic orders of a monarchy that had been voted out of existence in 1961. And a certain kind of foreign businessman was willing to donate handsomely for the privilege of being addressed as Sir. British and American monarchist societies took him up as a cause and organized receptions. It kept the lights on. It also meant that the last king of Rwanda spent part of his old age selling the only thing he had left, which was the idea of himself. He ran a foundation for Rwandan refugees out of that apartment. He gave interviews saying he would come home in a ceremonial role, like the Queen of England, if his people voted for it. The government in Kigali kept saying he was welcome to come back as a private citizen. He kept saying he was a king. Neither side moved, and the years went by. He died in October 2016, at 80 in the Washington area. And then finally, Rwanda took him. In January 2017, his body was flown home and buried in the Nyanza district, in the old royal heartland. He had waited 56 years to go back. He made it, in a coffin. The next man was born in a palace in Seoul. 50 years later, a journalist found him living in a van. The van was parked wherever it could be parked. He slept in it. When he wanted to wash, he paid the small entry fee at a public bathhouse and stayed the night, which is what homeless men in Korea did when the weather turned. This went on and off, for the better part of a decade. He was in his 50s and 60s. He had no fixed address and no money. In 2004, a reporter tracked him down because there was a story going around that the man in the van had been born in a palace, and the story was true. His name is Yi Seok. His grandfather was Gojong, the Emperor of Korea. He was born in 1941 inside Sedong Palace in Seoul, a prince of the House of Yi, a dynasty that had ruled the Korean peninsula for 500 years. He was born, though, into a country that was not free. Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and had spent 30 years dismantling the royal family, buying some of them off with Japanese titles and marrying others into Japanese nobility. So the boy grew up in a palace that was more like a very beautiful holding pen, watched by an occupying power, wearing the clothes of a prince of a country that did not exist on any map. Then the occupation ended, and it got worse. What the Japanese had not taken, the new South Korean government took. President Syngman Rhee had no interest in a royal family hanging around a young republic, and the palaces and estates were confiscated. The family was pushed out. Then the Korean War came through Seoul twice, and the boy who had been born a prince spent his adolescence in a country that had been leveled. He tried to make an ordinary life. In the 1960s, he became a singer, and this is the part people find hardest to square with everything else. He was genuinely popular. In 1967, he released a record, and the title song was a gentle little tune about a house for doves that everybody in Korea seemed to know. For a few years, a grandson of the emperor was a pop singer with a hit on the radio. The music did not last. Neither did anything else he tried. He ran businesses, and they failed. In the 1980s, he did what hundreds of thousands of Koreans did in those years and went to America. And he went the way many of them went, without papers. In Los Angeles, a prince of the House of Yi mowed lawns. He cleaned swimming pools. He cleaned buildings. Nobody around him knew, and if he had told them, it would have sounded like exactly the kind of thing an illegal immigrant with a mop would say. He came back to Korea in the 1990s to try to reclaim family property through the courts, and lost. He had spiritual crises. He spent time in a monastery, and somewhere in there, he ended up in the van. Here is where it turns. In 2004, the mayor of Jeonju, an old city in the south with deep ties to the Yi dynasty, invited him to come and live there and help the city tell its own history. He accepted. In 2005, he started teaching. The homeless man in the van became a professor of history at Jeonju University, lecturing undergraduates on the dynasty his own family had founded, and he has been doing it ever since. He runs a guest house in the traditional quarter. Presidents of South Korea have visited it. He gives more than 100 talks a year. And then, in 2009, the strangest honor of all. South Korea unveiled an enormous bronze statue in Gwanghwamun Plaza, in the exact center of Seoul, of King Sejong the Great, the 15th century ruler who created the Korean alphabet and is on the currency and is, by broad agreement, the most beloved figure in the country's history. There is no reliable portrait of Sejong from his own lifetime, so the sculptors had to build a face. They used a portrait of Sejong's older brother, and they used the face of the living descendant closest to that bloodline. They used him. So if you stand in the middle of Seoul today and look up at the Golden King on his throne, at the face millions of tourists photograph every year, you are looking at a version of the face of a man who spent the better part of a decade sleeping in a van and washing in public bathhouses. Not every fallen royal ended up poorer, by the way. One of them ended up with 500,000 acres. He also ended up driving a bulldozer across them in overalls, which was exactly what he wanted. His grandfather was, for a while, the richest man on the planet. Not one of the richest. Osman Ali Khan, the 7th Nizam of Hyderabad, ruler of the largest princely state in British India, put on the cover of an American magazine in 1937 as the wealthiest human being alive. The scale of the hoard is hard to hold in your head. Diamonds were weighed by the kilogram. Pearls were described by the acre. There was gold in bars, stacked in vaults, and jewels stuffed into truck beds and old newspapers because there was no room left in the strong rooms. And he was famously, ludicrously cheap. He wore the same clothes for weeks. He picked up cigarette butts left by guests. There are accounts of him bathing while still dressed to save on laundry. His grandson, Mukarram Jah, inherited all of it in 1967. On his mother's side, he was also the grandson of the last caliph of Islam, the final head of the Ottoman house. He was educated at Harrow, at Cambridge, at the London School of Economics, and at Sandhurst. On paper, there has never been a more lavishly credentialed heir in modern history. What he inherited in practice was chaos. India had absorbed Hyderabad in 1948. The privy purse and the titles were abolished in the early 1970s. He was surrounded by hundreds of hangers-on and relatives furious about his grandfather's will. Dozens of decaying palaces, thousands of dependent servants, and a legal situation that would generate lawsuits for the rest of his life. He hid from all of it in the garage, where 56 broken-down antique cars sat rotting. He said he had inherited a scrapyard and had a lifetime of work ahead of him. In 1972, he visited Australia, and the dry country north of Perth reminded him of the Deccan Plateau back home. He told his private secretary to buy him a small farm. What he ended up with was Murchison House Station, 500,000 acres of hard, poor land, 9 hours of rough driving from the nearest city. Bigger than several Indian princely states. He loved it. Nobody bowed to him there. He put on overalls and spent his days on a bulldozer, cutting tracks across his own outback, and his real joy was machinery. He collected wrecks from scrapyards, an amphibious tank he intended to drive down the river, an old British tank recovery vehicle that he fitted with an oversized radiator taken off a Perth City bus. The locals, who knew perfectly well who he was, gave him a nickname. They called him the Shah, and then they went back to work. The money did not survive. Between the litigation, the divorces, the servants, the machines, and a management structure that would have embarrassed a corner store, one of the greatest fortunes ever assembled drained out over about 30 years. By the mid-1990s, the station was gone, and his belongings in Perth were being auctioned to cover debts. He spent much of the rest of his life in a modest apartment in Istanbul, a long way from Hyderabad and a long way from Australia. He died in Istanbul in January 2023 at 89, and his body was flown home. Enormous crowds turned out in Hyderabad, tens of thousands of people lining the route, for a man whose grandfather had ruled them and who had personally chosen a bulldozer over a palace. The next one chose nothing at all. He was handed a semi-detached house in an English seaside town, and he stayed in it for 56 years. Number 24. Victoria Grove, Southsea, is an ordinary brick house in an ordinary street in Portsmouth on the south coast of England. Bay window, small front garden. Neighbors on the other side of the wall. Between 1964 and 2020, the man living in it was the last Sultan of Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a set of islands off the coast of East Africa, and for most of the 19th century, it was the center of the Indian Ocean world, cloves, ivory, and the slave trade, ruled by a branch of the Omani royal family from palaces on the waterfront in Stone Town. Jamshid bin Abdullah was born into that in 1929, in a palace with a country estate for the hot months. He was educated in Alexandria and Beirut, and he did 2 years in the British Royal Navy. He became Sultan in July 1963 when his father died. Zanzibar became independent from Britain that December. For about a month, it was a real constitutional monarchy with a real king. On the 12th of January 1964, a few hundred men with pangas and stolen rifles took the islands in a single night. The revolution that followed killed thousands of people, largely Arabs and South Asians, in a massacre that most of the world barely noticed. The Sultan and his family got out on a royal yacht and sailed for the mainland. He was 34 years old, and he had been on the throne for 6 months. Oman would not let him stay. There was already a sultan there, and nobody wanted the confusion. Britain did not particularly want him either. Officials in London worked up a plan to settle him somewhere far away with a trust fund, and the plan quietly failed. What he ended up with was a lump sum of £100,000 and a monthly allowance, and with it, he bought the house in Southsea. And then, essentially, nothing happened for 56 years. He learned to live like a retired English seaside resident, which he was not remotely raised to be. He failed his driving test on the first attempt, and the local paper enjoyed that enormously. He divorced and remarried, and the wedding was at the Portsmouth Register Office, the same one used by everybody else in the city. 4 more of his children were born in the local hospital. His daughters joined the Girl Guides, where the other girls were thrilled to have troop mates whose father was a sultan, and then everyone got used to it. Most of Portsmouth had no idea he was there. A man who had ruled an island kingdom, bought his groceries, walked to the seafront, and grew old in a house you could walk past without a second look. His brothers and sisters and children all eventually settled in Oman, where tens of thousands of Zanzibaris of Omani descent had been given citizenship. He applied to join them again and again for decades, and every time the answer was no, for reasons of state security that had stopped making any sense at all. In September 2020, at 91, a new ruler in Oman finally said yes. He flew out of England after 56 years. He died in Muscat in December 2024 at 95 and was buried in the royal cemetery there. He got out of South Sea with 4 years to spare. Compared to that, the last king of Egypt got off easy, though his story contains what may be the single strangest document in this whole video. Ahmed Fuad was born in Abdeen Palace in Cairo in January 1952. 6 months later, his father, the enormously fat, enormously corrupt, enormously entertaining King Farouk, was overthrown by army officers. Farouk's last gamble was to abdicate in favor of the baby, hoping a blameless infant might keep the dynasty alive. So a 6-month-old became King Fuad, the second of Egypt and Sudan, and a council of regents ruled in his name, and he was carried onto a yacht and out of the country, still in diapers. 11 months later, Egypt declared itself a republic, and the monarchy was finished. He was 17 months old. He was the 11th and last ruler of a dynasty that had governed Egypt since 1805, and he has no memory of any of it. He was raised in Switzerland. In 1958, Egypt stripped him of his citizenship, so he grew up not just as an ex-king, but as a stateless child. His father visited a couple of times a year until 1965, when Farouk collapsed and died at 45 after an enormous dinner in a Rome restaurant. Fuad was 13. He has lived a quiet, mostly ordinary life since. A house near Geneva, a marriage that produced 3 children and ended in divorce, and a job advising a Swiss watch company. And in 2014, Egypt issued him a diplomatic passport. Somebody had to fill in the box on the form marked occupation. What they wrote was, former King of Egypt. There is a man walking around Switzerland whose official paperwork lists his profession as former king. Now for the one that turns this whole story around, because she was not born into any of it. She was born in San Francisco. Hope Cook's mother was an amateur pilot who died in a plane crash when Hope was 2. Her father was a flight instructor who was not around. She was raised by her grandparents in an apartment in New York City, handed from one governess to the next, sent to a good private school on the Upper East Side, and then to Sarah Lawrence College, where she studied Asian history. If you had described her in 1959, you would have said, a shy, bookish American girl with a sad childhood and a lot of money in the family. That summer, she went to India, and in a hotel in Darjeeling, she met a widower named Palden Thondup Namgyal, who was the crown prince of Sikkim. Sikkim was a tiny Buddhist kingdom in the Himalayas, wedged between India, Tibet, Nepal, and Bhutan, with monasteries, mountains, about 200,000 people, and a Chinese army massing on the far side of the ridge. It was, in every geopolitical sense, one of the most dangerous small places on Earth. They married in March 1963 in a wedding covered by American magazines and newsreels as a genuine fairy tale, the New York debutante who became a Himalayan queen. 2 years later, at his coronation, she formally became the Gyalmo, the queen consort of Sikkim, and she paid a real price to do it, which is the part the fairy tale coverage skipped. To marry him, she renounced her American citizenship. Not symbolically. She gave up her passport. New York high society responded by dropping her from the social register, the old money directory that decided who counted, which was their way of saying she had married outside the tribe. She took the job seriously. She learned the language, worked on schools and local crafts and cultural preservation, and pushed the position that Sikkim was a sovereign country rather than an Indian protectorate. That last part was the fatal move. New Delhi decided the American Queen was the problem, and Indian newspapers went after her hard, floating the idea that she was a CIA plant. The nickname that stuck in the Indian press was the Spy Queen. By 1973, the kingdom and the marriage were both coming apart. She left with the children for New York, expecting to be back. She never was. In April 1975, her husband was deposed and confined in his own palace, and Sikkim was absorbed into India as a state. He died of cancer in 1982. So, an American girl who had given up her citizenship to become a queen found herself back in Manhattan in her 30s, raising children alone in a country that was no longer legally hers. She applied to get her citizenship back. Even after the divorce, it did not come easily. And here is what she did with the rest of her life, and it may be my favorite ending on this list. She got a job. She wrote a memoir. She became a book critic and a magazine writer, and then a newspaper columnist for the New York Daily News. She taught at Yale and at Sarah Lawrence and at a private school in the city. And she turned herself into an urban historian of New York, which is to say she spent her working life studying the streets and neighborhoods of the town she had left to go be a queen. She wrote a book about seeing the city. She has never stopped caring about Sikkim. Sikkimese communities still invite her to speak, and she talks about the kingdom with the clear eye of a historian rather than the sentimentality of an ex-queen, which is a harder and more honest thing to do. Her daughter carries a Sikkimese name. The palace in Gangtok is still there. The kingdom is not. There is a version of her story that is a tragedy, and plenty of writers have told it that way. The girl who gave up her country for a throne and lost both. But look at what she actually built afterward, out of nothing, in her late 30s, as a single mother with no citizenship. A career, a body of work, a life that was hers rather than one she had married into. She has lived quietly in Brooklyn for years. The last queen of a Himalayan kingdom came home and became a guide to her own hometown. There is one more, and he did something no other monarch in the history of the world has ever done. In the fall of 1955, a cadet at Valley Forge Military Academy in Wayne, Pennsylvania, was going through the same drills as every other teenager on that campus. Uniform inspection, marching, study hall. He was quiet, spoke several languages, and had the kind of manners that stood out in a barracks. He graduated in 1958. On the rolls, he was just another foreign student getting an American education. He was also, at that moment, the exiled King of Bulgaria. Simeon was born in Sofia in 1937 and became king at the age of 6. His father, Boris III, had spent the war performing an extraordinary balancing act, allied with Hitler on paper, while refusing to send Bulgarian troops to the Eastern Front and refusing to hand over the country's Jewish population. Roughly 50,000 people who survived the war because the deportations never happened. In August 1943, Boris was summoned to a meeting with Hitler, came home, and died within 2 weeks. He was 49. Bulgarians have argued about poison ever since. So a 6-year-old inherited a country in the middle of the Second World War, with 3 regions ruling in his name. And then the Red Army arrived. 2 of the regents, including the boy's own uncle, were executed. In September 1946, the communists held a referendum on the monarchy, and the results came in at over 90% for abolition, which is the kind of number that tells you what sort of election it was. The 9-year-old king and his mother and sister were given days to leave. Egypt first, where they lived alongside the exiled King Farouk. Then Spain from 1951, where Franco let them settle. Then Pennsylvania for school. Then back to Madrid, where he built a completely ordinary professional life. business, consulting, advising companies on doing business in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Married a Spanish aristocrat, raised 5 children, went to the office, 50 years of it. He was not allowed to set foot in Bulgaria for any of that time, not once in half a century. His passport for years was a stateless traveler's document. The communist government fell in 1989. He waited. It was 1996 before he finally flew into Sofia, 50 years after he had been put on a train out, and the crowds that turned out to see him were enormous. Then he did the thing. In 2001, Bulgaria was in a bad way. The economy had cratered, the political class was mistrusted, and the people were angry. Simeon, at 64, registered a political movement under his own name, ran candidates for parliament, and campaigned on a promise to change the country's living standards in 800 days. His movement won. It took roughly half the seats in the National Assembly, out of nowhere, in a matter of weeks. And on the 24th of July 2001, under the name Simeon Sakskybergatsky, the last king of Bulgaria was sworn in as the elected Prime Minister of the Republic of Bulgaria. There is no other case. Monarchs have been restored by armies, by foreign powers, by coups, by treaties. Simeon is the only one who lost a throne and came back to run the same country by winning a free election. He served a full 4-year term. He took Bulgaria into NATO. He signed the paperwork that started the country's entry into the European Union. And when his party lost the next election, he did the last necessary thing, which was to hand over power and go, and then to lose again, and then to retire from politics entirely and go back to being a private citizen in his 80s. When King Michael of Romania, the chicken farmer, died in 2017, Simeon became the last living person on Earth who had been a head of state during the Second World War. So look at what all of these people have in common, and what they don't. Every one of them was told from birth that they were different in kind from other people. Not richer, not luckier. Different, the way a mountain is different from a hill. And then, without warning, the thing that made them different was taken away, and they had to find out what was left. Some of them never did. Farouk of Egypt ate himself to death in a Rome restaurant at 45. Plenty of exiled aristocrats in Paris drank through what was left of the jewelry and spent 40 years telling stories in cafes about a country that was never coming back. Clinging to a crown that no longer exists is a full-time job, and it pays nothing. But look at the other ones. Puyi liked being a gardener. He said the happiest years of his life came after the prison, with a nurse he married in his 50s and a job growing flowers. Andrew Romanoff wore Birkenstocks, foraged for mushrooms, and painted pictures for the pleasure of it in a small California town. And the people who knew him best said he treated everyone exactly the same. Olga sold watercolors to pay for chicken feed and said she was proud of her wrinkles. Michael of Romania raised 5 daughters on the money from vegetables and test flights. Mukarram Jah, who could have lived in a palace with 300 servants, chose a bulldozer and a pair of overalls, and by every account, those were the good years. Yisiok teaches undergraduates. Hope Cook writes about her own city. The crown, it turns out, was the easy part. It was handed to them. They did nothing to earn it, and they could not have refused it. The hard thing, the thing that actually took something out of them, was learning to be a person with a job and a mortgage, and neighbors who did not care who your grandfather was. Some of them never managed it, and some of them found out in a flowerbed in Beijing or a farmhouse in Ontario or a rent-controlled walk-up on Lexington Avenue that they preferred it. It is worth saying plainly what that cost, because none of this was chosen. Not one of these people woke up and decided to trade a palace for a working life. It was taken from them, usually violently, usually by people who would have killed them if they had stayed. Puyi went through a prison. Michael was told 1,000 men would be shot if he did not sign. Olga was on her second flight from a government that wanted her dead when she was 66 years old. Yiseok slept in a van for years. Kigali died in a rented apartment 3,000 miles from the hills he was born in. Whatever peace any of them found, they found it on the other side of something terrible, and they found it late. But they did find it. That is the part I did not expect when I started pulling these stories together. The pattern is not that fallen royals are pitiful. The pattern is that the ones who let go of the title generally did better than the ones who spent their lives guarding it. And it was not close. A crown gives you an identity you never have to build. Losing it means building one, and building one is the only thing that has ever made anybody feel like they belong to their own life. There is one last image I keep coming back to. A man stands in line at the gate of the Forbidden City with his ticket in his hand, waiting his turn behind a family of tourists to walk through the house he was born to own. He is not sad about it. He has told this story before, and nobody believes it. He goes in, and he looks at the throne behind the rope, and then he goes home to his apartment and his wife and his job, and he is fine. If a story from this one stayed with you, tell me which one in the comments. And if you want more of these, the video on your screen now is the one to watch next.